So thank you very much for having me. Um, some years ago, I spoke to the Santa Cruz Archaeological Society at the invitation of Rob Edwards. And so I remember very fondly, having sharing a meal with Rob and also with Julie, at that time. And I'm sorry that Rob is no longer with us. He's someone that I used to call from time to time for advice on different things. And he always would, gave good advice. So, um, he's one of those that I regret he's no longer there that we can call upon, or I can call upon him and discuss things with him. Uh, you mentioned the two studies that I have in press, and maybe sometime in the future I could talk about those. But tonight I'm going to talk about something different. And I'm going to go ahead and share the screen so you can bring up my first talk. Okay, I'm going to now switch the screen here. Okay, I hope everybody can see this now. I'm going to start by talking about a study I did during COVID in 2020. And in this one, I'm using an example from the San Luis Obispo mission records and show how you can trace California Indian descendants from the initial people who were converted or baptized at the missions, and then through the generations down to people alive today. And the impetus for this study was a project for Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, because as everyone knows, there's a nuclear power plant up there at Diablo Canyon in the coast, kind of northwest of Avila Beach in San Luis Obispo County. And this map shows the location of the property that's owned by PG&E. And they were going to decommission Diablo Canyon. And in the process of doing that, they have to do certain things to fix up their roads going in and out of the plant, widen them and so on. And they'll be going through important archaeological sites. And so the county of San Luis Obispo put a condition on them because they said, well, you need to consult with Native Americans who can trace ancestry to the area where the Diablo lands are located. And so I was then hired by PG&E, and it came along just at a very opportune time when our museum closed down during COVID. And so I could work at home and work on this project pretty much uninterrupted for the summer in order to achieve the objectives that the county of San Luis Obispo had placed in PG&E. So the purpose was to identify Northern Chumash representatives today to consult with regarding the cultural resources on the PG&E's property there in the Diablo Coast. And so the way I approached this was, number one, which rancherias were in the area? How are we going to study there if we don't know where the rancherias were or the villages were? And so this is kind of an ethnogeographic question. The second was to figure out who was baptized from those rancherias. Once we know which rancherias were the focus of our study, then who was baptized from those communities. And third, then who were their descendants? So we needed to trace those descendants through the generations. And one of the ways of doing this was to first determine how many of those descendants were alive at the end of the mission period, and then which of families from those who were living at the end of the mission period could be traced through beyond the mid-19th century, beyond the mission period into the American period, down to the present day. So this was what I set out to do. And now there's been several studies done that's tried to figure out the ethnogeography of the northern Chumash area. And one of those was Bob Gibson's master's thesis that he did at Cal State Hayward. And Bob, this is Bob's map from his thesis showing the distribution of the rancherias that he was studying. He was studying mainly the Indians at Mission San Miguel and the Salinan people and San Antonio de Padua. And so here is sort of what he worked out as to where these different communities were located. And but you know, there's been additional research done since Bob did his thesis. And in fact, there's kind of 4 different maps that have been published. The first one would be in showing this area around the Diablo Coast. And so this is Bob Gibson's map that I just showed. And here is where he was mapping the villages in the vicinity of Diablo Canyon. And then Chester King, a year or so later, did his own study using some of the material that Bob had gathered and then adding on to that. And Chester came to some different conclusions. This is where Chester was mapping villages along the Diablo Coast. Some are the same as Bob, others are different. I then got involved some years later with a project for the National Park Service where we created a map of the entire Chumash region, or where the Chumash languages were spoken, from the north, you know, about to Paso Robles all the way down to Malibu in San Buenaventura. And in our map, this is how I mapped the area around the Diablo Coast in map C. And then finally, in 2005, Randy Milliken and I collaborated on a study for Caltrans, in which we again reconsidered all the data, each of us building on what the previous researcher had done and refining it and sometimes coming to different conclusions. And so this is how Randy and I mapped the rancherias in the vicinity of the Diablo lands. This is a comparison then between the 4 different attempts at mapping out the ethnogeography and what there were 5 different rancherias, 5 different villages that were had been by different researchers been proposed for that area. And we all agreed that one of these rancherias was Sukyu, shown here, which would be on Pecho Creek on the Diablo Coast, actually right there in the middle of the Diablo lands. And these are the Spanish spellings here on the left, by the way. The largest rancheria anywhere in the northern Chumash region was Sipcatu. This is the Spanish spelling, and that was, everybody agreed, was Avila Beach. So there was a consistency among all the researchers that these 2 were right there, either directly adjacent to the Diablo lands or on the Diablo lands. There was less consensus on the others. Chano, which some people had proposed, Bob Gibson originally proposed to be at Diablo Canyon. Chester put it just west of Avila Beach. I and Sally McClendon, we put it up there at Diablo Canyon. And then Randy Milliken and I later changed that to Los Osos Valley as being the likely location. I've since learned that the missionary at San Luis Obispo, the longest serving missionary at San Luis Obispo, referred to his mission as the Campamento de Chano, meaning the encampment at Chano. So he was considering Mission San Luis Obispo to have been within the tribal territory of the rancheria of Chano. And so it could have been Los Osos Valley, or it could have been somewhere, maybe in Upper Mission Creek, there near San Luis Obispo. But because it had been proposed as being the rancheria at Diablo Canyon, we included it in this study. And then there were 2 other rancherias, Petpatsu and Huejetmimu, which we really are somewhat hypothetical of where they were located. We thought one of the places we thought they might be located was at Montana de Oro on Islay Creek, where Montana de Oro State Park is, because it contains the word for abalone. And we thought, well, where are there rocks that might have abalones? They could be right there at Montana de Oro. And so it's a pretty far, it's not solid evidence, but we suggested it might be in that area. Okay, so here, this is just showing a portion of those Diablo lands and two of the rancherias that we are sure they were located there, Zapatu at Avila Beach and Sukyu, which would be on Petro Creek. And by the way, the Chumash name Sukyu is the word for breast. And so the Spanish, it's a loan translation into Spanish to refer to that creek as Petro Creek or the Petro Coast. And so that is the original Chumash name was then translated into Spanish, and that name is retained to the present day. And Zapatu then was the largest Obispeño or Northern Chumash rancheria located there at Avila Beach. So this is an old photograph showing Avila Beach the way it looked in 1915, and you can see all the oil tanks on the hill over here. Now this area has undergone a tremendous amount of development over the years and soil removal, and so there's no traces today of a rancheria that would have been occupied in Spanish colonial times. There's no evidence of glass trade beads or anything, but there's been such a large amount of development over time that it could be that the site has been pretty much obliterated, and any evidence of it occupied during mission times is now gone. So now let's look at the mission records themselves. Here are two baptisms side by side. They're by Father Esteban Tapis, who had beautiful handwriting and did a very good job at whatever mission he served at as recording the indigenous names and additional information. And so here you can see baptism number 930 and baptism number 931 in the baptismal register at Mission San Luis Obispo. And you can see here's someone who's from the rancheria of Zapatu, and then followed by someone who's from the rancheria of Sukyu. And so these are two of the ways they're spelling. What's great about this particular entry down here is it then goes on to say that the rancheria of Sukyu was situated on the coast. This is very rare at Mission San Luis Obispo. I wish more of the missionaries who were stationed there had been more specific about where these rancherias were located, because many of them were quite small. There's only a small number of people who come from them and very little clues about where they were located. So this is now a map that we developed for our National Park Service study back in 1999 that shows the territorial expansion of the mission as the mission outreach reached further and further inland and further outside of the locations of the first missions, and people were then incorporated into the missions. And you can see that San Luis Obispo had a much earlier spread of its influence than the other missions. That's because it was founded 10 years before the next mission in the territory where Chumash languages were spoken. And so you can see the area around Dogla Coast was rather early. The people then were absorbed into the mission community at San Luis Obispo. Okay, and then this is now charting the number of people baptized per year from the native rancherias at San Luis Obispo, beginning in 1772 up to 1834 or 1804, 1803, 1804, which would be about a 31-year span. So over 3 decades, then this is the baptismal pattern of people from their native rancherias. And by the end of 1804, there are no more people living in their native rancherias on the Diablo Coast who had not been baptized. So this is sort of the end of the period of people being incorporated into mission communities. So what we did is then look at everybody who came from their native rancherias during this period of time from 1772 to 1804, 1803, 1804. And they were all in a database that we began back when we were working on that National Park Service study. And then I've continued to do revise it and improve upon it over the years. So this is a list, just one page of a list of all the people who were baptized from Sukyu. And you can see that on the left is this column on the left is the baptismal number of the people. The L stands for San Luis Obispo, and these are their numbers in the baptismal register. These are the Spanish names of those individuals. The next column would be their native name, their origin from Sukyu. And this has been sorted, so it's only people from Sukyu on this page. The date they were baptized, their age, their sex. And if we can identify it, we have the baptismal number of the father and the mother. If we can identify them, the parents, then their number in the marriage record when they get married. Sometimes then after the first spouse would die, then they're married again and again and again. And then finally, that we have here the death of the people and their number in the burial register. Oop, go back a minute. Excuse me. Okay, here's their year of death then shown here. And what you can see on this particular page, we can account for everybody. We have the life history information of all the individuals who appear on this page. And that's because of the really excellent record keeping that was done at the mission. Okay, so here's an example of a baptismal record, again, of someone whose ancestors came from those Diablo Canyon rancherias, I mean, the Diablo Lands rancherias. This is Ana Maria Masta, who was baptized as on 28th of July, 1799. It says she was born in Spanish. It says she was born the same day and in the rancheria at the mission. So she's born at the mission, a pueblo there. And she was the daughter of Juan Jose Masta. She took her father's Indian name as her surname, and then Dominga, his wife. And Father Luis Martinez is the one who signed the entry. He's the one who refers to San Luis Obispo as the encampment at Chano. Anyway, Ana Maria's mother was from Zapato. Her maternal grandfather was from Sukyu, and her paternal grandmother was from Pepatsu. So her genealogy includes ancestors from 3 of the 5 rancherias that were part of our study for the Diablo Lands. Okay, so this is taking those 5 rancherias here on the left. These are the number of people baptized from those rancherias listed in the mission records. Then this is the first generation. These are children of this initial group here, including some that were born at other rancherias, but then these are all the children born at the mission, mostly at Mission San Luis Obispo, but a few at La Purísima too. Then the second generation, mostly born mostly at San Luis Obispo. Then the third generation, the children, these would be children of the second generation, and then the fourth generation who would be children of the third generation. And this is the total number for each of those 5 rancherias of people who were either from the rancheria or descended from someone from that rancheria, okay? And when we did all of this study, and then we looked at the burial records, we can see that there's only 3 people from Sukyu out of the 231 for whom there was no burial record found. So 3 people who descended from Sukyu, they found no burial record. And that comes to about almost 99%. Then we were able to match with or have the full life history information from those particular individuals. So we then conclude at the end of the mission period. Here are the 17 individuals whose ancestors came from those 5 rancherias, for whom no burial record was found. So these 17 individuals then became the focus of our study to see what became of them, because potentially they could have living descendants today that would be, appropriate to consult regarding cultural heritage issues in the Diablo Lands area. So fortunately for San Luis Obispo, what we have is a padrone. A padrone is like a census book of the Indian families at the mission. And this one dates to 1840 to 1841. Very rare. Most of the other missions do not have padrone surviving examples of a padrone that date to that late in time. And so we looked, almost all of those 17 people that we couldn't find a burial record for, we could find listed in the padrone. So they survived, we could say that they survived up until 1841. And this particular book was kept by the administrator at Mission San Luis Obispo, and survives as part of the records that are kept in a vault there at the Mission Archive Library in Santa Barbara. So now looking again at Anna Maria Masta, here is a genealogy for Anna Maria Masta that Randy Milliken and I put together. And here she is, shown here. And here's her ancestors, some of whom came from Sukyu and Petpatsu and also Sepatu, and as well as from Arroyo Grande over on this side of her family. Anyway, here's Anna Maria here. She was married twice. This is her first husband. This is her second husband. And then these are the children from those 2 marriages. She was actually married a 3rd time, but she outlived all 3 husbands. And then finally, her last daughter was born from a 4th individual who was an Anglo-American named Martin Cooper. And he was sometimes called Valentine, but there's a linguistic reason why Valentine and Martin got confused. Anyway, in the records, it looks like his real name was Martin Cooper. And actually, he came, although his daughter says that he was English, he's really an Anglo-American. Anyway, this is then, we discovered that there were 2 daughters, as I went through the records, who had descendants that I could trace. And one of them was Anna Maria's eldest daughter, who survived childhood. That would be Maria Augustina. And then her youngest daughter by Martin Cooper. He was given the Spanish name Fernando when he was baptized at Mission La Purísima, actually, given the Spanish name Fernando. But his birth name was Martin or Martin. Anyway, his daughter then was Maria del Rosario. And we can see then in the 1840 to 41 Padrone, there she is. There's Anna Maria Masta. She's listed among the viudas, the widows, and with her 3 of her children, Cecilia, Maria Augustina, and Juan Nepomuceno, who were then living with her. And what this Padrone doesn't show is that she was actually pregnant at the time the Padrone was made, because she then gives birth to Rosario, the daughter of Martin Cooper. And it's hard to read this handwriting. They've got ink bleeding in from the other side of the page, but they refer to Rosario Cooper's baptized name was Maria del Rosario. And it doesn't mention who the father is. It just says that she's the daughter of Anna Maria Masta, who was a widow. Okay. So here's Rosario Cooper. She this is a photograph taken by John Harrington about 1916. And Rosario was the last native speaker, last first language speaker of the Northern Chumash language. And she was, of course, when Harrington discovered there was still someone around who knew the Northern Chumash language, he worked with her intensively on a number of different field visits, coming to interview Rosario in her home in Arroyo Grande. She had moved and homesteaded property up in Arroyo Grande, near where Lake Lopez is today. Okay, this is the early drawing of Mission San Luis Obispo. This would be, and this is taken in about 1854. This would be when Rosario would be about 13 years old. This is what it looked like. So this is the community that she grew up in. There were still a number of Northern Chumash families living here. And she, in her interviews with John Harrington, she talks a lot about these people that she knew. And they can all be identified in the mission record. So that's one source for tracing what became of some of the people who were, you know, we didn't find burial records for, and we don't know what became of them. Well, we can trace them to a certain extent using the records, the later church records, but also Rosario's reminiscences. And moving forward in time, this is San Luis Obispo in 1865. Edward Vischer's a drawing of what the buildings look like in San Luis Obispo. And this is San Luis Obispo in the 1870s, the mission in the 1870s. And many of, Rosario's sisters' children and also Rosario's children, they were baptized at the mission, continued to be baptized at the mission to the end of the 19th century. And here's San Luis Obispo in the 1880s, the way it looked like. And this is the 1900 census. And you could see underlined in red, there's Rosario Cooper. She's living, this is the Arroyo Grande Township. She's living up in Arroyo Grande by this time. And she has a son, Frank Olivas. He's the next one I've underlined there, living a few households away. And also here in the 1910 100 census. So we can use the census records then as an additional source of information besides John Harrington's notes, we can use census records, we can use the church records to kind of trace these families through time, and other historical records as well. And so they're also, Rosario is also listed in the 1910 census. And then in 1916, she begins her work with John Harrington. And here's John Harrington sitting on the doorstep of her house in Arroyo Grande. That's her husband on the left, Mauro Soto, and then one of her grandsons in the middle, and then Rosario's sitting at the right. And now she had a son, as I mentioned, only one son who grew up, and he's shown on the left, Frank Olivas, and he himself had quite a few children, and these are three of them here as adults. One of them is Mary Olivas, Mata, and below her is Tim Olivas, and then on the right is Rosie Olivas Perez, and her daughter Juanita. And so all of these three children of Frank Olivas have descendants alive today, and there are others of his children who have descendants alive today. So this is a photograph that I took in 2013, and on the left, that little girl who's shown with her mother, Rosie Olivas Perez, is Juanita Graham, shown on the left. This is Juanita shortly before she passed away, and then behind her is her daughter, and next to her is holding her arm is Mona, who is the current chairperson of Yakchichu Yaktuhin, Mona Tucker. And next to Mona is her older sister, Lei Lin, and then who passed away a few years ago. And then on the right is Leah Mata, who many of you know. She's very, very talented in making jewelry and artwork. So just in conclusion, the approach taken here, you might be described as reverse genealogy. And it can be used not only for San Luis Obispo mission, but for any mission to trace tribal descendants beyond the mission period. The first thing you want to do is identify all those baptized from a particular rancheria. If we're looking for descendants from a particular location, then you have to identify who all the people baptized from that rancheria. Then using the mission register database that we prepared, you can determine the descendants of succeeding generations through the end of the mission period. We have computer programs that we worked out that do this for us. And then we can match those descendants for whom no burial was found at the end of the mission period. And then look in that last mission padrone. In the case of San Luis Obispo, we're fortunate that that padrone is so late, 1841. And then after 1850, when San Luis Obispo became part of the United States, or California became part of the United States, you can continue to search through census records, church records, and other historical sources to kind of follow the families insofar as possible. And then after descendants are identified, they collaborate with them. I learned a lot by interviewing and collaborating with the descendants of these people and obtained much richer account of their family histories through this collaboration. Now, the only families that I found in the end of this study down to the present day were the descendants of Rosario Cooper and her older sister, Maria Augustina. I tried the hardest I could to find other descendants, but really some of the people disappear from the records, and that leaves open the possibility that they could be descendants, but further, we're going to get lucky to find out other records that might document what became of them. Okay. So that's study number one. And I'm going to then have another short study that I'm going to give as another example of using the mission records. So let me close that one. And then let's go to the next one. Oh, I lost my shared window, didn't I? So I'll start to share again. Okay. So the second study I'm going to do here is talk about other stories that I emerged from the mission records, that I encountered in the mission records, that have to do with three early African-American settlers who married mission Indians. And as I worked through the records, I encountered these different stories and then found additional records that kind of amplified upon these stories. And so I want to share them with you today. So the three that I'm going to talk about are a man whose Spanish version of his name was Juan Cancio Guillermo Pitts, and he came to California in 1833, or he came to the Santa Barbara area in 1833. William Place, who in Spanish was called Guillermo Ples, who also arrived in 1833. Both of these individuals were from the Caribbean area. They were from the British colonies in the Caribbean. And then the third individual was Benjamin Elmore. And he arrived in California in 1849. Very different biography. He was born into slavery in Tennessee, and then was sold to someone who took him to Arkansas. He escaped by hiding in a barrel and made his way to California during the gold rush, settled in San Luis Obispo, and then later moved to Ventura. So each of these different African American have a different community in which they live. Juan Cancio Pitts was baptized at or married at San Luis Obispo to an Indian woman there. William Place, and he died at Santa Ynez. William Place was married at Santa Barbara, and Benjamin Elmore married a Chumash woman in Ventura, but he first was at San Luis Obispo. Okay, so let's start with Juan Cancio Pitts. I first encountered him in the burial records of Mission Santa Ynez. And here is the burial entry here. And it says there he's a descendiente de Africanos. He's an African descendant and natural of the island of Grenada, so in the Caribbean. So that was when I first discovered him. It also says that he had been previously married to a Indian woman of San Luis Obispo. This is when he died in 1838. And he died in a Chumash home next to Mission Santa Ynez. Okay, well, I thought, okay, he married at San Luis Obispo, and so sure enough, when I found his marriage record, it was in San Luis Obispo in 1834, and here it gives a slightly different account of where he originated. It says Juan Cancio Pitts, and it says de Marara. He's a single, and he married Maria de Loreto, who was a widow and an Indian of this mission of San Luis Obispo. Okay, and it turns out she's kind of got an interesting story. This was her fifth husband. She was her fifth marriage. She had survived 4 other husbands, and then her last husband was this African American man from the Caribbean. But it doesn't say he's from Grenada here. It says de Marara, and the missionary interpreted this to be a place, of Marara. So that's the way it was interpreted by the missionary. So I kind of was perplexed because I've never heard of a place called Marara, and I looked and I didn't find it. What I finally figured out, though, in his case, was that he was from Demerara, and it didn't mean he wasn't of Marara. He was from a place called Demerara, which was the old name for what later was called British Guiana, and the town of Georgetown in Guyana was actually originally called Demerara. So this is not Grenada after all. He may have lived on Grenada later, but in his marriage record, it says this is where he's from. So maybe he was born in one place and then lived in the other place. And the other interesting thing about his baptism is it turns out that his marriage is it turns out that the witness to his marriage, or best man, you might say, was the husband of Ana Maria Masta, who I just talked about in the preceding talk. Okay. So, who was the mother of Rosario Cooper. Anyway, here is Santa Barbara. Now I'm going to talk about the second African-American, William Place. And so he came to Santa Barbara on a ship. He was sick, and so he stayed behind while the ship went on, stayed behind in Santa Barbara. And this is the way Santa Barbara looked about the time he would have been living there. He came in 1833. This is the way Santa Barbara looked about 1830. And you can see the mission up to the upper left on the hill there. And here then, 13 years later, 12 years later, excuse me, he marries. And so this is his marriage record in the Presidio Book of Marriages of Mission Santa Barbara. So he was living in town, and he married an Indian woman who was from Baja California. It says she's from the mission of San Miguel, which is just north of Ensenada there in Baja California. And in other words, she was probably a Tipai or Kumeyaay woman. this is their marriage record, 1845. Okay, they had 3 children. Their eldest daughter was Maria, and this is their baptism records from the baptismal register there at the Presidio of Santa Barbara. You can see, or the town of Santa Barbara. You can see there's Maria Antonia Ramona Place. She went by the name Ramona. Then the second child was named after the father, Guillermo Place or William Place Jr. And then they had a third daughter, Elena Isabel Place, born in 1850. And here we have the 1852 California State Census. You can see they're listed here, William Place, Maria Apollonia, then his daughter, Maria Antonia Ramona, his son William, and his daughter Elena Isabella, all listed in Santa Barbara. And here it states that he's a mulatto, identifies him as a mulatto. It also states that he's giving his, he's making his living as a cook. And he's also listed in 1850 census, which lists him also as a cook. So it also says that he's originally from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. And he had last lived in the state of Florida before coming to California. And we know that Guillermo Place or William Place was a property owner because he's listed in the book of properties of real estate book for the original town of Pueblo of Santa Barbara. And here is describing his house. And it's mentioned as being 9 varas by 6 varas, which would be about 25 feet long by about 16.5 feet wide. And there's furthermore, because there was a map made just a few years later, we actually can see the location of this house. Here's the map of the original Pueblo of Santa Barbara, all these little kind of pinkish buildings are where the adobes were originally in the Pueblo of Santa Barbara. And then if we blow up this one down here, we could see that's the home of William Place. That's that 9 vara by 25 vara building, or 25 feet by whatever it was. Anyway, that's where he was living. And it also shows the other properties in Santa Barbara. He was, this is the De La Guerra Plaza in Santa Barbara today. And the street grid that you see here, this is the street grid that was overlaid and became the streets that exist in Santa Barbara today. And eventually it took out the house of William Place, but this was after he had died. We do also have a will for him that made in 1854, and he died the following year. But he says, in this will, he says, I give and devise to my wife, Maria Apollonia, and to my children, and he names them, Maria Antonia Ramona, William, and Helena Isabel, in common, all and the only real property I possess, the house and lot in which I now reside, being in the city of Santa Barbara. But it's my desire that my wife Apollonia do not sell any portion of said property, which I do now by will devise to her. And he says, I give and bequeath all the residue and remainder of my formal estate, and so on, to his wife, to his children, and appoint his wife as the sole executor of this, my last will and testament. Then he goes on and mentions to whom he owes money to and who owes him money. And some of this is quite interesting. He says here, for example, that Joaquin Valdez owes him $40 or one of the oxen, and that Jose de Jesus Oliveira owes him 1 mare, and Guadalupe Cordero owes me 1 tame cow. Okay. And then he said, you know, he wants his wife to follow through to pay off his debts and then collect the debts that other people owe him. Well, what happened though is just 10 days after he made this will, he changes it. He amends it, and he takes away his wife as executrix of the will, and instead has his attorney become the executor of the will. And furthermore, so something happened. There was some kind of marital discord that occurred between William Place and Maria Apollonia that led to him changing the will. Maybe she didn't like some aspect of it, but he said that in the second will that she can get what she is entitled to in terms of half of the property, but the rest would go to his children, and he makes his attorney the executor. Okay, well, we know what became of, at least we don't know what became of Maria Apollonia. She disappears from the records, but we do know what became of his daughter, Maria Antonia Ramona. Here she is, a photograph of her. She married in 1862 Louis Wolff. Now, who is Louis Wolff? He came from the Alsace region of France. He came during the gold rush, or shortly after the gold rush, I think about 1852, to California. He tried mining, was unsuccessful. He then went down and established a store in Temecula. And not long after that, he married Ramona Place in Los Angeles, and then she lived with him in Temecula, where their children was born. And here they are in 1870 census. Here's Louis Wolff and Ramona, three of their children, and then Ramona's sister, Helena Isabel, shown her 19 years old, living with her sister's family in Temecula. And here's a photograph, or a drawing of the way Temecula looked in 1880s. And right here is the Wolff residence. That's where the Wolff store was located, their house, and so on. And they, Louis Wolff not only had a store, he had a tavern. For a while, he was justice of the peace. He tried to be a land developer for a while. He was kind of a law unto himself there in Temecula. And he also was an intermediary between the Luiseno Indians and people who wanted to employ them to work on their ranches. Later, right about a little earlier, actually, before this drawing was made, the Wolffs were visited by Helen Hunt Jackson, who was the author of a couple of very important landmark books. One of them was Century of Dishonor, about way American Indians have been treated, and the other one was Ramona, which was a novel that she intended to kind of call attention to the plight of California Indians that were being forced from their homes. For example, like what happened at Temecula. And Helen Hunt Jackson stayed with the Wolffs in Temecula, when she was gathering information about assessing the Indians, condition of the Indians in Southern California. And she learned from Ramona and about the eviction of the Indians from Temecula, which then ended up they had to move from their homes, and the government set aside land at Pechanga for the reservation. And so she wove this into her novel. This is part of the novel Ramona, this eviction of the Indians. And she named the book Ramona. And some people have suggested that this book was named after Ramona Place, who would be the daughter of the African-American and his Indian wife, and who had been born in Santa Barbara. Okay, the third story I'm going to tell you is about Benito Elmore, or Benjamin Elmore. And the first record I found for him in the mission records is his marriage in 1863 at Ventura to a Ventureño Chumash woman. And here it says, it gives the name of his parents, Matthew Elmore was his father's name. His mother was, they say in Spanish, Juana, so she might be Jenny. That when he was born in Tennessee, it mentions here, and then he marries an Indian woman, Maria, at San Buenaventura. And we have then them listed then a few years later in the US Census. Here's Benjamin Elmore living with his wife, who's mentioned as an Indian. And she, again, it gives his ethnicity as Black, gives her ethnicity as Indian. He's a day laborer and originally from Tennessee. We know that he made his living, at least part of the time, by roofing people's buildings with tar. So he would waterproof people's roofs. He was a roofer in Ventura and was apparently well liked by the citizens of Ventura. And so this is the way San Buenaventura looked like in 1870. So this would be this is the Coast Survey map showing where people were living. I don't know exactly where the Elmores were living, but it likely was, well, we'll get into that in a minute. But here's the mission of Ventura right here. Here's the Ventura River. And now, we know from John Harrington's notes, because John Harrington interviewed Simplicio Pico, and I think that my opinion is that this is likely a picture of Simplicio Pico. I know this particular image has been identified differently by in previous publications, but I believe that this is likely, that those are mistaken, that this is likely a picture of Simplicio Pico. Anyway, because we have no other pictures of him, and we have a picture actually of John Harrington with this man, and I think it's likely Simplicio. Anyway, here's Simplicio. This is Simplicio, and he was married to Petra Pico, a famous basket weaver at Ventura. And Petra was no longer living when Harrington conducted his research, but he worked extensively with Simplicio Pico. And Simplicio told him that he and his wife were very close friends with Benito Elmore and Benito's wife. And he says that Benito Elmore was well liked by the Indians. He and his wife would speak together in Ventureño, that Benito Elmore learned the Ventureño language. He also learned Spanish. So he spoke English, Spanish, and Ventureño. And he played the violin and was told amusing stories. So he kind of, it's because of John Harrington's interviews, we have a little bit better picture of what Benito Elmore was like. And Simplicio also told Harrington that Benito Elmore's wife, Maria, became sick. And so she wanted an Indian treatment. And so they then, Simplicio and Petra and Benito and his wife, Maria, all got together in a wagon and traveled to Peru. And they visited Juan Fustero. And here's Juan Fustero and his family who lived in Peru. And Juan Fustero then administered the the old Indian treatment of giving her red ants to swallow. And she swallowed the ants, and that made her vomit, and she felt better after getting the red ant treatment. This is a treatment that seems odd to us, but it was used by California Indians in parts of Southern California. And so anyway, she felt better, but eventually she returned to getting sick and died. And then they returned to Ventura after that happened. So moving on, then after her death, Benito Elmore continued to live among the Chumash community in Ventura. And this is a photograph taken up on the hill behind Ventura, looking out to the ocean. And on the left, you can see the Mission Church over here. This is Mission San Buenaventura Church. And off in the distance, this row of houses were occupied by Chumash families, by and large, who lived along this street. And then there was a tavern, a bar, I located, I think, about here, called the Parian. And that figures into the story that I'm about to tell you. But anyway, among this community in Ventura, this Indian community, we can, in 1880, there was a census made. And here is Benito Elmore, Ben Elmore, they call him here. He has a young Indian woman who's a boarder in his home. But this other woman above him, who's also African-American, Rebecca, was his next wife. And so here's Benito and Rebecca, and then this other Indian woman. And then next door to him is another well-known Chumash family. In fact, a number of Chumash Indians living next door. And you have this Indian woman, Juliana. All you can see, their ethnicity is all listed as Indian. And Juliana's son was Jose Peregrino Romero. He also worked with John Harrington later on, Jose Peregrino Romero, or Winai. This is his wife, Susanna, and two of their children. And then also, so there they are. And then also in their home is this boarder named Vicente Garcia. And all of these people played a role in the story I'm about to tell you. So here's Jose Peregrino Winai and his wife, Susanna, who were just listed in the census. This is a photograph we have of them in Ventura. And then another neighbor were these Indian women. Showing these were other neighbors. There's Petra Pico on the left, who again was a close friend of Benito Elmore and his first wife. And then in the middle is Donaciana Salazar, and on the right is Candelaria Valenzuela. And Benito Elmore was the godfather for one of Candelaria's children. Okay, so what happens is that in 1883, in September 1883, there was cries that were heard in the middle of the night, and that both Candelaria and Petra went out to investigate, what the cries were coming, and they found an Indian man who had been stabbed and was dying, and they went to the neighbor house where Benito Elmore and Jose Peregrino Romero were, and together they carried the man into Petra's home, where Petra and Candelaria were living, and then Jose Peregrino Romero went to fetch a doctor, and while he was dying, they asked him, "Well, who did this to you?" And he spoke in the Ventureño Chumash language, and he identified the common law husband of Donaciana as being the perpetrator of him dying, of stabbing him. And that man was Vicente Garcia, who was listed in that 1880 census immediately next door to Benito Elmore. So there was a trial of Vicente Garcia, and Benito Elmore testified in the trial that he understood the Indian language, and that he said that the dying Indian had specified that, or had accused Vicente Garcia of having stabbed him. However, then he was found guilty and was sentenced to be hung. And they built a scaffold, and there was, while the appeals were undergoing, that finally the appeals ran out, and he was going to be hung there in Ventura. But in the meantime, further information came to light that one of the witnesses for the prosecution was likely the perpetrator of the deed. It wasn't Vicente Garcia after all, and that the man who was dying it had been dark, he was drunk, and may not have really known. And furthermore, Vicente Garcia was with the woman he formerly had been living with, and he may have been jealous of Vicente. Anyway, they cast doubt on whether Vicente Garcia was really the person who had killed the man, or stabbed the man. But that he'd already been found guilty. And so there was a whole appeal then made, including by the foreman of the jury, that found him guilty, by Benito Elmore, who signed the petition as well, to the governor of California, asking them to commute the sentence. Well, what the governor did is he did say, okay, we're not going to hang him, but he still got sent to San Quentin, and he ended up living the rest of his life in San Quentin. So Benjamin Elmore, eventually himself passed away at Ventura in 1897. Some of the accounts I found indicated that he was buried in the mission cemetery, but the mission records didn't show that he was. There's no interment for Benjamin Elmore in the mission cemetery, and instead, someone who I mentioned this to went and looked online and found this death record or burial record that he was buried in a different cemetery there in Ventura. So, in conclusion, the study of these three lives of early African Americans, I think, brings to light previously unnoticed aspects of Black history in our area, particularly in the relationships these individuals form with local Native Americans. And likely all three of these African Americans were born into slavery: Juan Cancio Pitts and William Place in the British colonies in the Caribbean, and Benjamin Elmore in Tennessee. But what's interesting, I think, is to consider the fact that England, way before the United States, passed an abolition act to abolish slavery in 1833. And that is the year of arrival of both Juan Cancio Pitts and William Place in California. So I wondered whether these two events might not have been coincidental. They may have become free citizens and therefore came to California as free citizens. And then finally, I want to mention that this research highlights again how useful mission records are in recovering stories of ethnic communities that have not received enough attention until recently. Thank you. Okay.
Let's give a round of applause for John Johnson here. That was wonderful. Thank you for sharing that history with us.
You're welcome.
It was, really amazing to see all the stories that you have extracted from the archives. I do think we have some questions here in the chat. Let's see. Lolly asked, do baptized Native Americans follow the same Mexican regulations of marriage of outsiders as other local residences, such as requirements to convert to Catholic and Mexican citizenship?
Yeah, back in mission times, that was a requirement. I should mention that I'm an exception because I'm not Catholic, but I was married in a Catholic ceremony and the priest married us, but back in colonial times, you had to be Catholic in order to get married. Yeah. So what they do say in the mission records is they notice and they note when the couple had been previously married in an indigenous ceremony in their native society, they mention that. They say this couple had been married previously in native society before they came to the mission, and all that they did in the ceremony was after they'd been baptized, they just basically consecrated the marriage, in a Catholic ceremony.
Okay, another comment says, sounds like he was coerced by his attorney who later became his executor. There were stories like that in Cattle on 1,000 Hills by R. Cleland. That must, I think he was talking to, sorry, the cat, kitty bomb here. The story about the, I can't remember the name, but where they changed the executor to the attorney at the last minute. that must be who he was talking about.
Yeah, I don't understand it. Why he basically kind of took away the power that his wife had in the first will and changed that in the second, just 10 days later. I don't know what made him change his mind.
Yeah, it's hard to tell.
Hard to tell.
Okay, and Charlie says you should upload some photos to the Find a Grave record. I'm not aware of that. Are you aware of that, John?
Well, I use that when I when I use Ancestry. In fact, I should mention that I used Ancestry.com to kind of trace out some of these families in that first study. And something just happened here.
Uh-oh. I realize we're a little
There
bit
we go.
over, so if anybody needs to
I think
leave.
I unplugged my heater. I thought I was unplugging my heater. Instead, I unplugged the computer. So the computer. Okay.
I have a question. On that first, early in your presentation, you were showing the baptismal records, and you know, towards the end, there was you know, one of the last years, it just really shot up in quantity.
Very good. Yeah.
Can you explain that? Is that just kind of a last ditch effort to baptize everybody, or I might have lost okay. Sorry, I think we lost him here, folks.
Yeah, I think we lost
I'm gonna
John.
go ahead and stop the recording now.